Rome's most feared cavalry was not Roman. For over 2 centuries, the Republic and later the Empire depended on light horsemen from the mountains and plains of North Africa. Riders who fought without saddles or bridles, guiding their horses with nothing but pressure from their knees and a simple rope halter, capable of harassing an enemy formation and vanishing before a countercharge could ever reach them. Roman military writers considered this style of unencumbered mounted warfare almost impossible for their own heavily equipped cavalry to replicate, and treated Numidian horsemen as a genuinely irreplaceable specialist force rather than an interchangeable auxiliary contingent. Hannibal used them against Rome, and their skill was a major factor in several of his most devastating early victories. Rome then recruited them against everyone else, from Gaul to the eastern Mediterranean. Julius Caesar fought them in a civil war. Augustus eventually absorbed their kingdom entirely into the machinery of empire. They were the Numidians, and the question of where they actually came from has been quietly reshaped by some of the most surprising ancient DNA findings to emerge from North Africa in the past decade. Findings that overturn assumptions people didn't even realize they were making. Numidia, in the ancient sources, occupied the territory of modern Algeria and parts of Tunisia and Morocco, a Berber kingdom that reached its greatest power under King Massinissa in the 2nd century BCE. Massinissa had fought on both sides of the Second Punic War, initially allied with Carthage before ultimately switching his loyalty to Rome, a decision that proved decisive at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where his cavalry helped Scipio Africanus finally break Hannibal's army for good. That alliance positioned Numidia as one of the Mediterranean's genuine regional powers by the time of Massinissa's death, a kingdom wealthy enough, organized enough, and militarily significant enough that Rome treated it as a serious diplomatic partner rather than a peripheral tribal territory, allowing it to expand steadily at Carthage's expense throughout Massinissa's remarkably long 54-year reign. That relationship soured under Massinissa's descendants. Jugurtha, a grandson of Massinissa, fought a long and bitter war against Rome in the late 2nd century BCE after seizing the throne through the assassination of rival claimants, a conflict that exposed deep corruption within the Roman Senate and helped launch the political careers of both Gaius Marius and the young Sulla. A century later, Juba I sided with Pompey against Julius Caesar in Rome's civil war, and after Caesar's eventual victory, Numidia was formally annexed as a Roman province. Juba's son, Juba Tai, raised in Rome itself and married to Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, was eventually restored to rule a client kingdom that blended Berber, Roman, and Hellenistic culture in a genuinely unusual royal court. Before that kingdom, too, was finally absorbed into direct Roman provincial administration. Throughout all of this political turbulence, the Numidian cavalry remained one of the most consistently valuable military assets in the ancient Mediterranean, serving in Carthaginian, Roman, and various client kingdom armies across 3 centuries of near-continuous warfare. Roman writers describe them with a mixture of respect and exoticizing distance. Skilled riders from a distant, sun-scorched frontier, useful but fundamentally other. The deeper question those Roman writers never really answered, and which archaeology alone struggled to resolve, was where the Berber-speaking population that produced Massinissa, Jugurtha, and generations of feared cavalry had actually come from in the first place. For much of the 20th century, the working assumption among historians and archaeologists treated North African population history as a relatively straightforward story of successive incoming waves. A deep, poorly understood indigenous layer, followed by documented historical migrations associated with Phoenician colonization, Roman settlement, and much later, the Arab conquests of the 7th century CE that brought Arabic language and Islamic religion to the region. Berber identity, in this framework, was often treated as a residual category. Whatever remained of the indigenous population after all these successive layers of contact and colonization had been peeled away. Ancient DNA has revealed something considerably deeper and considerably stranger than that residual category model ever suggested. The most significant finding came from analysis of skeletal remains recovered from Tafralt Cave in eastern Morocco. associated with the Ibero-Mauritanian culture, a sophisticated hunter-gatherer tradition that flourished across the Maghreb roughly 15,000 years ago, well before the emergence of agriculture anywhere in the region. A study published in Science in 2018, led by Marieke van de Loosdrecht and colleagues, successfully extracted ancient DNA from several Taforalt individuals, among the oldest human genomes ever recovered from the African continent. And the results overturned a long-standing assumption almost immediately. Given North Africa's geographic position, researchers had generally expected the deep ancestry of these ancient hunter-gatherers to show a substantial connection to sub-Saharan African populations to the south, consistent with the most straightforward interpretation of the continent's geography. Instead, the Taforalt genomes showed a genetic profile with roughly half of their ancestry connecting most closely to populations from the Near East, specifically related to the Natufian hunter-gatherers of the Levant, the same population that would go on to develop some of the earliest agriculture in human history. The remaining ancestry showed a genuinely deep, ancient lineage that appears to represent one of the earliest diverging branches of the modern human family tree found anywhere outside sub-Saharan Africa, alongside only a modest sub-Saharan genetic component present but clearly a minority contribution rather than the dominant signal researchers had anticipated. This was not the expected result. It suggested that North Africa's deepest population history involved substantial genetic connection across the eastern Mediterranean and into the Levant tens of thousands of years before any Phoenician ship, Roman legion, or Islamic army would later cross that same geographic space and receive historical credit for connecting North Africa to the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. A second major study, published in PNAS in 2018 by a team led by Rosa Friegel, extended the genetic timeline forward, examining ancient DNA from later Neolithic period sites in Morocco and finding evidence of a subsequent, distinct wave of ancestry entering the region roughly 7,000 years ago. Genetic input closely related to early European Neolithic farming populations, most plausibly arriving via the Iberian Peninsula across the narrow strait separating modern Spain from Morocco, rather than through the broader eastern Mediterranean route that had shaped the earlier Taforalt population. Together, these two studies sketch out a North African population history built from at least three distinct deep layers: an ancient, uniquely North African lineage found nowhere else in comparable form, a substantial ancient Near Eastern genetic connection dating back to the era of the Taforalt hunter-gatherers, tens of thousands of years before recorded history, and a later Neolithic-era genetic contribution arriving from the Iberian Peninsula. This is the genetic foundation upon which the later, much better documented historical layers, Phoenician trade colonies, Roman provincial settlement, and the 7th century Arab conquests, were subsequently added, each contributing genuine but comparatively modest additional genetic material to a population whose deepest roots were already staggeringly ancient and already connected in complicated ways to populations far beyond North Africa's immediate geographic neighbors. The Berber-speaking populations who would eventually produce Mycenae's Numidian kingdom descend most directly from this deep foundational layer. Not a population that arrived recently from somewhere else and simply settled the Maghreb, but the descendants of hunter-gatherers who had already been living across this landscape, already carrying this unusual and unexpected genetic signature for well over 10,000 years before Rome ever needed their cavalry. This matters enormously for how Numidian identity gets understood, both in antiquity and in modern political and cultural contexts. Roman sources, and much subsequent Western historical writing built on those sources, tended to frame North African populations as a periphery. Useful, exotic, valuable in specific military and economic roles, but fundamentally defined by their relationship to Mediterranean civilizations arriving from elsewhere: Phoenician, Roman, eventually Arab. The genetic evidence flips that framing on its foundations. The population Rome encountered when it began recruiting Numidian cavalry was not a recently arrived or recently formed group defined primarily by outside contact. It was one of the most ancient, continuously present populations anywhere in the Mediterranean world, carrying a genetic signature already tens of thousands of years in the making by the time Massanisha was born, a signature that had itself already absorbed a substantial and surprising ancient connection to the Near East long before any Phoenician trader or Roman administrator arrived to claim credit for linking North Africa to the wider ancient world. Modern Amasai, or Berber, communities across Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya carry this same deep genetic inheritance today, often alongside more recent genetic contributions from the historical periods that get discussed far more frequently in popular accounts of North African history. Phoenician, Roman, Arab, and later Ottoman contact. The deepest layer, the one that actually defines the core population history of the region, predates every single one of those more famous historical episodes by a margin of time that is difficult to fully register. The Taforalt individuals lived roughly 10,000 years before the pyramids of Giza were built, and their genetic descendants were already standing on North African soil, carrying a genuinely unusual and ancient inheritance when Massinissa's cavalry first rode into Roman military service. There is also a quieter genetic echo running in the other direction, back into Europe. The same Iberian-related Neolithic genetic contribution that Friegel's team identified moving south into Morocco around 7,000 years ago represents just one direction of a Mediterranean genetic exchange that ran both ways across the strait separating Africa from Europe throughout prehistory, and later Numidian and Berber genetic contributions are detectable in modest but real proportions in the populations of Sicily and southern Spain, regions that maintained close trade, political, and eventually military contact with North Africa across the entire span of classical antiquity and long afterward. Massanissa's cavalry did not simply serve in the Mediterranean world. Their descendants, in a small but measurable way, remain woven into the genetic fabric of the European populations they once rode alongside and against. The Numidian cavalry that terrified Roman infantry formations and eventually became indispensable to Roman military success were never the exotic newcomers that Roman writers and the historical tradition built on their accounts tended to imply. They were the descendants of one of the oldest continuously present populations in the Mediterranean world, carrying a genetic story more ancient and more surprising than anything the men who wrote about them from horseback distance ever imagined. Massanissa's kingdom, Jugurtha's rebellion, and Juba's Hellenistic Berber court were not the beginning of North African history meeting the wider Mediterranean world. They were simply the most recently documented chapter in a genetic story that had already been unfolding, quietly and continuously, for well over 10,000 years before any of them were born. The bones from Taforalt Cave sat undisturbed in the Moroccan earth for 15 millennia, holding a genetic record that no Roman historian, no medieval chronicler, and no 19th century colonial anthropologist ever thought to ask about, because none of them had any way to imagine that the answer to North Africa's deepest origins would eventually be read not from a text, but from a molecule preserved in a cave that predated writing itself by 10,000 years.